Welcome to Ed Talks. My name is David Slomp. I'm Board of Governors Teaching Chair here at the University of Lethbridge, and with me is Dr. Gideon Fujiwara in the Department of History in the Faculty of Arts and Science here at the University of Lethbridge. Dr. Fujiwara is the recipient of the University of Lethbridge Student Union Award for Teaching Excellence. So congratulations on,
Thank you very much.
On receiving that award. Yeah.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. Thanks for the invitation, David.
The Ed Talk series is a great opportunity to showcase work in teaching excellence here at the university and to help the public understand what goes into that kind of ethic and that kind of a commitment. So we look forward to hearing from you. Maybe we could start by just talking about your journey to the University of Lethbridge and your work in the Faculty of Arts and Science. What brought you to where you are right now?
So I've always had a great interest in history and in reading, and so when I did my BA at UBC, I did a double major in history and English literature. And in my third year, I took this fantastic course on Japanese history. It was taught by Professor Namlin Her, and I really took to the subject. And when it came time to writing the research paper, I wrote on Japanese identity in the Tokugawa period. And the book that Professor Her recommended was Remembering Paradise, which is written by Professor Peter Nosko. This will make sense later. So this book was really very influential on my intellectual growth, and I wrote the paper. And later I pursued a master's in Japanese intellectual history. This was in Japan, in Tohoku University. And as I was discovering my passion for history, I was also renewing my interest in studying Japanese, which was my heritage language.
Yeah.
I was born in Japan. I grew up in southern Alberta and Vancouver. And so I was doing history and language. And the MA was very rewarding, but it was also very tough, as I think anybody who's done one can attest to. And I never thought I'd go back to academia again, but after a few years, I was drawn back to doing history research. And when I was looking for programs that where I could do a PhD in Japanese studies, lo and behold, Peter Nosko is now the head of Asian Studies at UBC, and so I studied under him. I wrote my dissertation on transforming communities in 19th century and identity and the experience of modernity at the local level. And I received wonderful guidance there, and that's one of the blessings that I've had, to have great mentors. And I've been able to pass on what I've received, the support and the guidance in my teaching here. And it was when I was teaching it was when I was doing my grading for a course on Japanese history over at UBC that I got a call from U of L, about this position, and I was invited for the interview. And so, I feel that my interest in the history and, of course, my experiences in research, but also the teaching that I did experience at UBC helped to prepare me for this position. And I've had a great 5 years here.
So the interest in Japanese history as an undergrad, was that part of that self journey already then, or did that kind of come later? When?
Yeah, I think at home we spoke Japanese. Between my parents and the kids, between siblings we spoke in English, right? But so there was always that language in the background, and we'd be exposed to some Japanese history. But I think it was when I was about 19, 20 at the undergrad level that I discovered it intellectually, at an academic level, and my curiosity was piqued, and I wanted to learn more, and I also wanted to travel Japan, and all of these interests converged. And that's when I seriously studied Japanese history, beyond the undergrad, and all of that has led me here.
What have you gained personally from your studies at undergrad all the way through the graduate level? It's been a really rewarding experience. So, obviously you gain knowledge and I think insight about history and about society.
about the human experience, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we study about people of the past and societies of the past, but in a lot of ways, their experiences relate to, what we see in our world today.
Yeah.
And along the way, I think I've learned about perseverance and working hard, and sometimes you're walking in solitude, but I've learned to focus and to concentrate on and think about important topics in history. And you make great friends along the way, and you encounter great mentors, and with a lot of that good support, it makes the journey that much more meaningful.
Yeah. You've mentioned mentors a few times.
Mm-hmm.
What have you learned about scholarship and about teaching from the mentors in your life?
There's so many different approaches to teaching, of course. I think a lot of my mentors, they were very good at telling stories,
right.
And that's something I think I've tried to adopt. I think important stories are interesting, inherently interesting, and because they're relevant, but I think the way that somebody internalizes a history, an event, a story, mm-hmm. and how they convey it, through a lecture, through discussion, right? They might facilitate a discussion. They'll present to you documents, primary sources, books, articles, and facilitate your learning in that way, in a very interactive way. So those are all, I think, approaches that I've adopted. And I think the other aspect to this is that these are all wonderful people, who were inspiring and who gave to the community, and I think so. There's that academic professional side, but certainly the human side of it is that I've developed great friendships with these people, and so that's, for me, I think, now that I'm a teacher, mm-hmm. I think I put a lot of value, right, in those personal relationships, and seeing that students, sure, there's deadlines for papers, but they're also dealing with their lives, and challenges arise at times, but I think building that relationship with the students is certainly an important part of teaching, I think.
How do you bring story into your teaching?
There are stories that, from my own experiences, of course, that I'll tell in class. The story about my personal journey, and how I came to study Japanese history, of course. When I visited Japan, for example, in 2010 to 2011, I spent a year doing doctoral research. I was funded by the Japan Foundation, and was spending my days in the archives and the libraries, looking at these sources. And it was during that time, it was in March of 2011 that I experienced that earthquake, and I experienced 3/11, the earthquake and triple disasters there, and I was in Hirosaki, which is inland, so it wasn't as hard hit as some of the coastal areas. But for example, experience like that, it exposed me to this very important event in recent history, and communities coming together, in face of a crisis, and not only the community of Japan, but the global community coming together in support. And so, seeing something like that, not just through headlines, but being in that place, and then people talking about, what it means to be a nation, and what it means to be a community. I think that a story like that has certainly helped me to understand better some of the things that I'm studying, and so I might share that story in a lecture, in a discussion. But that's just one of many, of course, and through interactions with different people, people I've met along the way. If I feel that it relates to the history, I will introduce it.
What did you learn about sort of Japan as a nation state from that experience, and what did you see from that history that you've been studying that was kind of shaping the nation's response to that?
And that's actually, I'm trying to answer that question with a book, actually, with a sort of ongoing research. But Oh, definitely. I think, when you think about nation, right, and nationalism and the era of nationalism, and I mean, today we're living in Canada, which is one of some 200 nation states in the world, right? And we think in national units, and we think along these lines. But I think an event like that, for instance, it showed a strong sense of nation. The people coming together. It also we got a sense of the region of Tohoku, northeastern Japan, coming together. Tohoku was probably not known to people in the world until then, and even in Japan, it wasn't very clear awareness of that region. Right. But now it's become it's in people's minds, and so. It's allowed me to look, and a lot of people to look, I think, at the multiple levels of community and how dynamic community is on multiple levels, and the tensions, of course, right? When addressing the crisis, the rescue and the recovery and the rebuilding. We see the challenges that different levels of government and community will face, right, and in working together. But you certainly see changes in demographics in that area, and I'm studying the history of that area, focusing mostly on the early modern to the modern period. But it certainly gives you perspective when you see events like that in more recent times.
Yeah, for sure. So receiving teaching awards is always it's always an honor. It's a great honor. I think it's especially so when it's a student union driven award, because it's the students themselves that are putting you forward and honoring the work that you've done. Can you talk about how obviously you build great relationships with students? That's where an award like that would come from. How do you build those relationships? What do you focus on? What do you do? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, it was a huge honor to be awarded this student union prize for teaching, and well, I think typically the relationship with the students begins in the classroom, right? So one thing I do try to do is learn people's names, and I actually did teach a class in this very room this past spring, and there's something like 50 students, and I try to learn their names and it's, I mean, as we, as I take questions, respond to questions, and you have students speaking, to each other in discussions. There's that rapport that's built, right, and that dialogue, and then that sometimes extends outside of the classroom if they're seeking help on papers. Right. On how to prepare for exams, they'll come to office hours. So I'll always, tell them, my doors are open. Feel free to come by, and we'll talk. We'll do shop talk. Talking about papers and the courses. But sometimes we'll talk about life beyond the university and grad school and I've gotten to know a lot of students through thugs, the History Undergraduate Society, our history club, and a great group that are very engaged, in their study of history, but also very involved in the campus community, the local community, and helping to put together events and bringing students together, right? And so gotten to know execs from that club, and we have great conversations, and they put on fun events that we take part in, and we help each other too, because I try to support their events, and they certainly help when we put on colloquium talks. Right. Their involvement, of course, is key to the success of these kind of events. I think it's neat to get to know students in the classroom, and then we'll have conversations outside the classroom as well.
Right. Yeah. How does learning, it's interesting because I think back to my undergrad, and I took a linguistics course. There were 200 students, and the prof there would he'd do roll call every class. So it was 1 hour a day, 3 days a week, and he would do roll call, 200 students. And I remember sitting there the first week thinking, what a waste of our time. But it was amazing to me how by about week 3, I could be sitting in the back corner of the room, and he could say, Mr. Slomp, what do you think? And he'd look right at me.
Very nice.
And it totally change the way, the feel of a 200 student lecture hall.
Yeah.
So what's your experience of sort of, learning students' names and how that changes your classroom?
So I do try to learn names, and I'm also realizing that I'm aging. I'm learning fewer names now than maybe 5 years ago. Still, I've got different strategies, but I actually was doing roll call my first year here. And since I read my student evaluations very closely, I got a lot of comments saying, "You're wasting 5 minutes of the lecture time," right? And so but I do see value in the roll call, so I'll do roll call maybe the first couple of weeks. And then I'll make notes as to where they're sitting, and after that I'll pass the attendance sheet around, and I joke with my students that I've devised this brilliant way to do attendance, and that is that I have them sign in on a sheet of paper in the position that they're sitting. So I'll make a grid on a sheet, and I'm telling my students I should have this patented, and maybe earn a side income on this. But but this is a great way to learn where the students are and get to know them. And then like you said, I'll be able to ask certain individuals their thoughts on certain topics, and especially if they're writing a paper on that topic that we're discussing in class, right? So, it makes us aware of each other, the instructor and student. But I have to confess that even by the end there are some names that I just don't remember for some reason, whatever reason, and I always. I think I do I give it an honest effort.
Well, before you patent it, I'm going to steal that idea because
I'm
getting old. I'm getting old too, and I'm having a harder time with memorizing student names as well. But it's such an important part of building that relationship. Yeah. What do you try to achieve? So you teach history at different undergrad levels, and that what are your goals for your courses? What are you hoping? Obviously, there's content that you want students to know, but what are maybe some of the deeper things that you're trying to aim for?
Absolutely. Well, there's so many goals in mind, and I'll say this too, that when I started, I got lots of great strategies through the teaching center and great workshops and learning from colleagues, and really has enriched my approach as well. I think as for goals in my courses, I do a range of them: world history, history of East Asia, early modern to modern Japan, imperial China, nationalism, modernity. There's a whole bunch of them that people can take. But I think the study of history is so important because it tells us where we've come from, as a society, and as a community, and where we've come from, where others have come from, where our fellow citizens have come from. These histories, of course, link to the experiences of the students' parents and grandparents and ancestors, right? So I think it teaches us about, again, the human experience. It teaches us to respect one another and to empathize with one another. And again, the human experience of that I see in Japanese history, say in 19th century, for instance, I look at community at multiple levels, and I look at how people in a local community were experiencing drastic change through modernity and opening up to the West, adopting ideas from advanced Western nations, from China, of course, as they had done for centuries. And we see the story of the emergence of the modern nation, the modern nation state, and how this affects common people, right? And so you look at that experience, and you critique the power structures there too, right? Like the powerful state making efforts to create this modern and powerful, prosperous nation state, while molding their the people into these modern citizens, right? So these are peoples with diverse cultures, diverse dialects, diverse ethnicities, right? And these people are molded into modern citizens of the nation state. So you look at this experience and how this has touched indigenous peoples in northern Japan, how it's touched peoples across the archipelago, but in Okinawa, and when the nation expands into an imperial power and a colonial expansion on the Asian continent, you see how this imperialism affects right, peoples in Taiwan and Korea and on the continent. And so, telling the story of the nation, in terms of the state, of course, but also how the people experience this, and the struggles and the sufferings and the perseverance again, right? The challenges, and I think knowing how these earlier societies, how they operated, how they constructed community based on certain ideologies, certain values, it informs us in what kind of communities we want to create and how we want to shape our own society. So lots of lessons to be gained in that sense, and also on an academic, professional side, there are lots of practical skills, right, to be obtained from history courses. Analytical thinking, research skills, professional and clear writing, public speaking even. I get students to do presentations and lead discussions at the upper levels. And so I think, there are very tangible skills to be gained. And I let them know, in the beginning that, these are the goals that we're thriving for in my courses.
Are there lessons today for Canadian society that you want your students to kind of pull out of what you've learned through your research and your work with Japanese history? Since
I'm publishing on 19th century Japan, again, I'm looking at community and how this nation of Japan, which had been relatively isolated, they had a restrictive foreign policy that they practiced from the early 1600s right up to the middle of the 1800s. And so I do again, right, I draw lessons from the experiences of the nation and the members that the citizens, the subjects that experience this. Nationalism is one of the themes that I look at, certainly, and so nationalism is this powerful force. That's and in the modern period, it's been around for a few centuries. It is very formative, but it's also very destructive. It can be exclusive as deciding who's part of the nation, who's part of a community, and who isn't. And so lessons that we take from our study of these communities and a force like nationalism, which continues to be a part of this world today. I think these are they're valuable insights to for us to understand our own community and our global community and how we want to shape our society. Nationalism in an earlier time was primarily defined on ethnic terms. There are now civic definitions of nationalism, but still, this is again one of many ideologies that shape the world around us, and so understanding the past and understanding our society better. These are some of the objectives, I think, of the history that we study.
You talked earlier about using primary source material as part of your teaching. How do you find that material, and what sort of primary source material kind of speaks to students most effectively?
Okay, there's primary sources, as one of my mentors often said, they're the lifeline of studying history, and so I use that in my my classes. So there are repositories of primary sources, right? There are source books that are out there. There are a lot of good ones, and I rely on certain ones. There are good collections of primary sources online as well, and I use the course pack here that's made by the bookstore, and this has been great. So I get excerpts of primary sources. So for the main themes in East Asian history that I teach at the second year level, I've got a whole collection of sources, and I really try to present a wide variety of voices, right? Multivocality is so important. Men and women, young, old, statespeople, but the common people as well. And you want, in a class, I'm really trying to present the voices of different peoples from different backgrounds, demographics, so that we can try to create a wholer picture, right? And there's lots of rich sources. For example, drawing from 15th century Korea. The Korean alphabet was created then, and so I present a number of pieces that debate, the merits and the minuses of creating this alphabet. On one hand, it allows more people to read and write, and it makes it more accessible to the common person. But some elites are intimidated. They feel threatened that their classical learning that they've spent years on is being threatened. But these are universal themes, right? Language, national identity. These are questions that in my classes, the students quickly link this to Canada, right? And our bilingual 2 languages, and of course all the other languages that we're able to learn today. So those are some sources that that speak to students. There's another one that's very popular called The Way of the Samurai, written by Yamaga Soko. So this is from the 17th century, at a time when Tokugawa society is relatively stable after some very violent civil wars and the state asserting its control over the populace, and so this one samurai official is reflecting on the role of the samurai warrior in the society, and saying, well, we don't farm, we don't trade goods, we don't create, we don't build houses like other members of society, but we ought to be dutiful, we ought to serve our lords, we ought to serve our communities, whether it be through night watch or what have you. And so, this piece is very popular as well because, some students get introduced to this history through samurai movies, right? So you can see, some students, citing this for papers, which is great. But also, it is a self-reflective piece that asks, where an individual asks oneself, what is my place in society? What are my rights? What are my duties? What is my responsibility? And if I'm not living up to it, then I'm not earning my keep, my stipend. And so, I think we have discussions where this might get linked to things that are happening in contemporary society and ourselves. And some will say, oh, the samurai were very noble and self-reflective, and others will say they were just a bunch of parasites. They were eating based on the hard work of the peasants. And so a great look at social issues that I think also are relevant today.
That's fascinating. How much do you kind of turn your students over to the primary source material and expect them to kind of work through and develop interpretations, as opposed to you presenting it and an interpretation with them? What do you do with students in that? How do you get them to work with primary source material?
So typically what I do is that, the primary sources are contained in the course pack, and it's a nice compact little booklet, and I tell them, okay, well, we have assigned discussion days. So I'll say, I'm told that predictability is good in the classroom, so I say, okay, this day of the week we're going to do discussions. Okay, so Thursday will be our discussion day this term, and so please bring your course packs. And so they'll know at the start of the course what sources are contained there. And what I do is every week, about a week in advance, I give them discussion questions. I'll show them in class. I'll put them on Moodle. It's very helpful because the students can they can read the sources with those questions in mind. And I really want them to grapple with the sources themselves first. But I do give them guiding, some questions to give them some direction. When we meet on that Thursday, and after I've given my lecture, I say, okay, now it's, let's hear your thoughts on these readings. And so at that point, I'll either get them to speak in groups, or I'll open it up right away. And then, students will, put up their hands and they'll comment on the themes, on the questions, based on those readings, and they'll cite from the sources. And the way that I do the discussions is I give students a chance in class to speak on the sources, but also follow that up with an online component, right? So we'll use discussion forums on Moodle. And so, yeah, students will build on what's been said in class, and they'll speak to each other, and they'll and so it'll be very interactive in classroom and online. And then next class I'll try to address some of the comments that were made online. So there's this ongoing discussion, and I'm not the most tech savvy person, but this is Moodle that's worked really well for me. And I think students have come back to me later and have said that, yeah, they appreciated how interactive the discussions were, and that they had a choice, of how to express themselves. And so, but I'm always open to tweaking and adjusting and bettering my methods for sure.
So what are you hoping they're learning from sort of their own, sort of independent engagement in primary source material?
Well, primary sources are, again, these documents created by contemporaries of that period, right? So, well, you're forced to think analytically. You're forced to, first of all, you're reading what's there, right? What's on the surface. But I'm encouraging them to read between the lines. In my exams, for example, I love to assign. I'm presenting. I'm talking a lot about the sort of the details of my classes, but so I may present a couple of pieces, excerpts that we've looked at in class. I'll present a couple of them, and without identifying, their source or their author, and I'll get the students to identify, okay, who wrote this, what was the context for it, what was the period, to give context to what were the social conditions in which these ideas were expressed, and then I'll get them to analyze what's written there, and then linking it to the bigger history. And I think those kind of analytical skills, that kind of critical thinking towards documents, we apply that in our everyday, right? Whether we're looking at contemporary events or looking at new laws that are enacted, what have you. I think those are skills that I certainly see students transferring in the world and in the workplace as well.
You mentioned earlier, as the modern Japanese nation state was being developed, that their experiences that the Aboriginal peoples in Japan had as that process unraveled or as it moved forward. What's similar? How is that experience similar to the experience of Aboriginal peoples in Canada? Or how is it different? What have you noticed about that?
Yeah, there are striking parallels, I think, in the two cases. And I did actually teach a course that did a parallel look at Canada and Japan emerging as these modern states, both constitutional monarchies. There are lots of parallels. As Canada marked its 150th anniversary this year, Japan marks 150 years since the Meiji Restoration, which starts at the end of this year and goes through 1868, right? And so there are lots of parallels, and I think the tragedy of the state imposing its will, its policy of assimilation on indigenous peoples. This is a history that's seen in Japan, and we see, even from the Tokugawa period, we see the Tokugawa state really trying to colonize the northern island to preserve it as a buffer from the north, from Russia and from any threats externally. And this colonization, it does happen again during the Tokugawa period, but it becomes accelerated in the 19th century. And so the Ainu, the indigenous peoples, who had for centuries, been practicing hunting and gathering and fishing, and had their very distinct and sophisticated communities and lifestyle, they were uprooted, and they were forced into agriculture. They were, again, forced to become these loyal subjects in a modern state, loyal to the emperor. And so I think, we see, the struggles, the oppression that the indigenous community in Japan experienced, and a loss of identity, right? Loss of language. Lifestyle was was taken away, and again, in an attempt to create this modern, uniform national citizenry, right? The subjects of the state, and so yeah, again, critiquing those power structures, right, and how the state uses power and in an exploitative way, right, and how. And who is affected by it? The indigenous peoples, peoples across the archipelago who, had preserved their own local communities. People who had worshipped in their local shrine. They had worshipped their local tutelary deities, their kami, for many generations. When the state modernized, these local shrines were forced to, in many instances, amalgamate into a larger shrine, right? That would serve a new kami, a new god, right? And so this project of the modern state, it certainly it disadvantaged many people, we see the pitfalls of some of these state policies that were implemented in the 19th century, but certainly into the 20th as well.
Yeah. Are there lessons for Canada? I mean, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had asking us as a society to grapple with that moment in our history. Are there lessons from the Japanese experience that might help us with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think a lot of historians, social scientists, humanitarians, I mean, they've been looking at Japan, and if anything, movements in Canada, for instance, in North America, some have observed that there may be a 20-year lag, and you see it 20 years later in Japan. And so Japan, I think, in a lot of cases, is trying to learn from Canada's example. Canada being a multicultural society. The instance of the state and indigenous peoples, I think the Ainu have look to reach out to other indigenous peoples around the world, including First Nations in Canada. And I know that there's dialogue there, and in an attempt to work toward reconciliation in Japan. A lot of the lessons are being learned, by people in Japanese society from examples here. But I think a lot of the problems, the issues, the challenges. They are related, right? Based on the failures, the conflicts of the past. We have a better understanding of what it means to be a multicultural society, and to recognize and to encourage ethnic, cultural diversity. But it's an ongoing lesson, and I think that there's certainly lessons taken from the case in Canada, but also I think so I've certainly seen literature that compares the two cases in Canada and Japan in terms of the state and First Nations indigenous peoples. But I certainly there are lessons to be taken there.
When we deal with these kinds of issues, sometimes the closer to home they are, the harder it is for students to deal with them. I think when I used to teach high school language arts, I would do a series of units around issues of racism and we would start with racism in Europe during the Nazi era, for example, and it was very easy for our students to say, boy, Nazism, and that was bad, and then after a bit we would look at the Canadian experience. We would look at Joy Kagawa's Obasan, and we look at the way Japanese Canadians were treated during that same period in Canada, which was more difficult for students to kind of to grapple with. And then I'd often bring it right close to home, and we'd do some field trips. I taught north of Edmonton, so we'd bring students into Edmonton, and we would do field trips with adult ESL classes from the city, where the students really got to spend a day with people from very different cultures and really kind of to confront issues and perspectives around racism that way. Do you find dealing with, say, the indigenous experience in Japan helps students in Canada to gain some perspective around, you know, the Indigenous experience here in Canada, or does that come up at all in your teaching?
Well, I think when certainly, yeah. I mean, I think the students quickly they see the parallels, right? And I think you know, when you study, you know, when I look at, say, 19th century history in Japan and elsewhere, you know, you see the powerful state and attempts at assimilating, right, and creating this uniform nation, and the efforts at you know, quote unquote civilizing the populace, right, and those, you know, discussions of you know, the advanced civilized peoples and those who are primitive or backward. I mean, those discourses are heard in Japan and across Asia as well, right? And you know, that binary of civilized and barbarian, you know, it surfaces in right, pre-modern Asian writings too. So actually looking at, I think, you know, especially when we look at 19th century history in my classes, I think people start to see that the world is actually quite interconnected, and, you know, there's a lot of borrowing of ideas, but yeah, there is a lot of similarity in the attempts in the colonial. The efforts to colonize and to try to you know, quote unquote civilize a people and to squash diversity and culture, right? And now we're seeing the tragic consequences of this, and you know, we're trying to you know, encourage the rebuild and the recovery, and you know, it takes time, obviously, this process. But I think in that sense, studying Japan and studying East Asia, you know, it certainly. I think students do gain valuable lessons, I think, from the material, and again, from the critiquing of, you know, how the state and the individual, you know, and how they are, you know, in terms of the power structure, and and I think, again, presenting the voices of the people who endured this, I think, is something that I strive for in my teaching, and you know, and in the last month of my main themes in East Asian history course, I mean, we look at the modern period. You know, we look at modern imperialism and war in East Asia. We look at you know, primary sources, you know, where there's, you know, vicious hostility, you know, expressed towards, you know, enemies. You know, there's pieces written decades after the war, you know, by Japanese who you know, that express remorse and regret for past military aggressions, you know, and colonialism. And then there's pieces that gloss over the suffering, you know, gloss over the atrocities, and they would rather celebrate the valor of their soldiers. And so, you know, we look at sometimes controversial issues, you know, war memory, memory of past colonialism, and we have, you know, thoughtful discussions about these topics, and I think that students, I think that I'd like to think that, you know, we that collectively we're taking away valuable lessons about you know, how to remember the past, and again, this informs us in how we relate with one another in society, and that empathy and that understanding of one another, and, you know, where we've come from as a society, and the mistakes of the past, and I think that. To better learn these lessons, you know, we'll be better citizens for it.
What are the challenges you face as you're working with your undergrads and your graduate students around developing these kinds of understandings, and that, you know, what are the things that you struggle with as an educator?
Yeah, teaching is truly rewarding, but it's also truly challenging, right, at times, and. I remember, you know, shaking off those nerves. You know, the first time you teach a course, that's something that I, you know, worked at, and I, you know, some of that just comes with experience. But I think, the challenge is, you know, whether it be history of Japan or history of the world, or his introduction to Asia. you're having to decide, okay, from this this ocean of knowledge and sources and historical actors, which parts do you present to the class, and you want to do it in a meaningful, in a manageable way that's accessible to students, and I think that so it is a challenge always to to decide, okay, what materials to present, and then to communicate it through a lecture, and I do try to put some humor in there, or try to tell some interesting anecdotes. To help to ease the process, but so I guess the challenge of presenting a good balance of material, to fairly and in a balanced way to present the materials to students. I think this is always something that I strive for, and getting just encouraging the students to get engaged. I think we've got a lot of bright students who are motivated, so often that's not a problem, but teaching just various topics. I mean, one of the great things about this position is that I sometimes joke with my colleagues that I'm responsible for the histories of 3 to 4 billion people, of Asia, and those are just the contemporaries. But how do you present it in the right way, or in a meaningful way? And students will add to that, through their input, of course. But also, dealing with sensitive topics, is always a challenge. And I've had students come up to me after I spoke about war, imperialism, for instance, and saying, "Oh, you're Gideon, your voice, your voice is gone today. I hope you feel better." And I was thinking, well, it's not that I'm under the weather, but the material is very very heavy, and but one thing I do is I always walk to work, in the morning, and that walk helps me to think about what I'm going to speak about, and visualize how I'm going to convey it, and it's sort of a meditative walk, but it prepares me, for that course, and I always, in the morning, I think, I'd like to really deliver this material in a meaningful way that students can benefit from it and learn, and that we can that they can gain valuable insight from our classes, and that's the same for me too. I learn a lot from the classes and engaging with the students as well, and of course engaging with the materials.
What do you learn from your students?
Boy, a lot. I learn a lot from the students. So I'll present material, and through the lecture, we'll have a discussion, and the students will often say something that I had never thought of it, and certainly in the discussion part and through their questions, but also in their papers, for example, no historian knows histories of all subjects in all places. So I'm always learning, certainly knowledge, but I do see in a lot of the students, just a concern. Compassion, towards towards their fellow human beings, and how people sympathize or empathize with certain historical actors, and certain topics, and I think that really comes across in people's comments, and how and a lot of these students, they're involved in the student union politics, or they're involved with history club, or they're working in the community, or volunteering, or involved in various circles, and so you see, I think, young engaged citizens among the students, and that's great to see, and I think we. As you teach, and they say, if you want to learn something, you should go and teach it, and you teach it, and then the response that you get makes you think about it further. I think, and I think that that's invaluable to me. And I have to say that, this summer I have this journal article that's coming out. We're very excited about it. It's looking at the growing accessibility to sensitive political information in 19th century Japan and the rise of national political awareness in 19th century Japan, and I'm going to use it in my teaching, of course. Students, I'll make them read it. But I do find that teaching is great as you do research because as I'm writing my book and my articles, I'm forced to think about, okay, how do I want to use this in my teaching in the future, and so it's right. Teaching and research, they certainly inform each other, and it's funny during the summer months when I focus on my research, I'll often reflect on discussions we had in class, and some of those good thoughts that were expressed, they'll give me good ideas too. So I think that teaching is definitely an interactive, participatory experience, right?
Yeah. No, we make much at universities about researchers also being teachers, right? That and often there's a resistance to the idea that we can separate and have a stream of researchers who do a bit of teaching and then teachers who do mostly teaching and very little research, and we often argue, no, you need to do both. What's your experience about how your research supports quality in your teaching?
Well, I think I'll get a good look at that when I assign my own readings in class and see how students respond. But the research, of course, that's your area of expertise, right? And so that's where you can really get in depth into what you're teaching. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how students do. Respond to what I've done in research, when it comes to the classroom. Recently I had a student wrote a paper in my class on early modern to modern Japan, and they said they used the book that had a book chapter in, and that was exciting. And so I will going forward continue to do my research and do my teaching and have the two feed into each other and inform each other. I'm still in the process of bridging the two, but it's something that I look forward to do into the future as well.
You mentioned earlier about sort of that early in your career, sort of the nervousness around teaching. Yes. I still get nervous before I start every new course that I teach, but kind of what have you learned along the way the last 5 to 8 years or so about quality in teaching? What are the things that you've really worked on in your own development? As I teach,
I'm seeing the importance of being myself, right? Being myself, and I think with history, it's all about orienting yourself and orienting the historical actors, and so in a way you're sort of seeing yourself in this larger history. So being myself and conveying the ideas, the information that I have with confidence, and of course there's a lot of rigorous reading and preparation that is required to do that. But I think always being self-reflective and reflecting on teaching, and I've gone to my history colleagues many times, for bouncing ideas off one another, and I've had my colleagues observe me in my teaching, and they've given really supportive and really helpful feedback to me. That kind of peer review is really helpful, and always trying to learn of new ways to enhance my teaching. Lots of great techniques, that I learned from my colleagues, but also again through resources like the Teaching Center. That's been huge, and of course with all the technology that we have, I do use some of it, right? And so teaching is an ongoing. It's an ongoing craft, right? That you continue to hone and fine tune. But being myself and being comfortable with the material, and I think when you're able to do that, the nerves sort of they go away. But standing in front of 90 students, at times it can be, it is a challenge. But yeah, I think I'm, finding myself as an instructor and as a researcher.
Yeah.
So with that comes more confidence, I think.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. I get to teach in the ed faculty, so I get to mentor new teachers for the school system and that, and I'm always amazed that you mentioned sort of that metacognitive, reflective kind of, how important that is. And I find always, at the end of a lesson when I've observed a student teacher, I'll ask them, what went well? Or what didn't go well? And it's, my best student teachers are always the ones who have the most to say about what didn't go well.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And the ones who are weaker often have very little to say about that. And it's interesting when you talk about being reflective. What have you kind of learned through self-reflection that's helped you kind of grow in your practice?
Yeah.
What are the things you've observed about your own teaching?
Yes. I mean, there's so many ways that you get feedback from the students, right? I mean, one is just, visually you can see their level of engagement, whether they're, and some of the material, it depends on the class and the subject you're teaching, of course, but, are they engaging? Are they, discussing? Are they responding to your questions? Just so that level of interest, that level of enthusiasm you see, what people respond to and maybe what people don't. And everybody's got their own interest in history, so of course that varies. But it's student evaluations, and of course I look at those closely. Yeah, I'll often reflect on how did this lecture go last time I taught it, and I'll try to build on that. And sometimes just the simple wording that you use, could really change the dynamics of a class, right? And so, the positive feedback, the feedback, where students are saying, "Oh, that was a great discussion, really enjoyed it." And then the feedback that is constructive or critical. I've had that too, and I've appreciated that too. And you certainly get that in the student evaluations. But the students, I tell them, if you don't mind taking a couple minutes, please do let me know what worked well in the class and what could be improved. And this is all for my self-improvement as a teacher, but it's for your own benefit if you take my classes again, and for the benefit of your peers. And so, I always try to reflect on the responses that I've gotten, and so it's certainly an ongoing process, learning how to teach.
I do exit cards periodically throughout my courses, or the students anonymously, and I ask them 3 questions. What worked well? What would you like me to continue? What would you like me to stop doing? And they don't have to put their names to it, but when they go out the door, they'll put the card on the chair beside the door, and then I'll go through them. And I find I'm remarkably terrible at reading a room. I'll see students and I'll see students and they'll be heads down or whatever, and I think, boy, I'm really not doing good today. And then there'll be comments about, it's really warm in here and it's late in the afternoon, and that's been really good for me sometimes to see that and go, okay, obviously I need to do something to address that, but there's more going on than just than just me. But I find students really respond well when you give them those opportunities throughout the year to kind of give you that feedback about what's working or what's not.
That's something I may try as well. I always just rely on the student evaluations that you get, that they do online. But it is because I do ID cards at the beginning to get to know their names and get to know their interests. And but it may be thanks for the tip. I think I may do that to follow up at the end. And who knows? I might even return their ID card and let them sort of fill out the backside or something.
I think that brings us to the end here. So thanks very much for sharing your insights and
experiences.
Thank you, David.
Really enjoyed this.
Right.
Thanks a lot.